Our next perspective that we're going to cover is the information processing perspective, which is often associated with the 1960s to the 1980s, but it was most popular amongst experimental psychologists, developmental psychologists, and motor learning scientists between the 1970s and 1980s. Now, given its time, period, location, it's considered the bridge between the maturational perspective and the ecological perspectives by considering that development is somewhat influenced by biological processes, but it places a greater emphasis on the environment. So in this respect, the information processing theory explains developmental changes as a result of behavioral or environmental causes. So that's what we have our definition as up here. Now, according to this perspective, the brain acts like a computer. So it will take in information from the environment, processes that information through neural circuits, and then creates an output that is then sent out to our muscles to generate a movement. So motor learning and developmental processes can then be described in terms of computer-like operations that occur as a result of some external or environmental input or stimuli. Research that contributed to this perspective was primarily centered around various aspects of performance, particularly related to motor learning. So this would include some topics such as stimulus-response bonds, which is basically encompassing how we make associations between certain stimuli and motor responses. Feedback was also a central topic, which includes types of feedback, such as internal feedback versus external. You might have heard this referred to as intrinsic versus extrinsic feedback. It also encompasses knowledge of results or performance. Also of interest related to feedback might be the methods of providing feedback, as well as the timing of feedback in relation to the performance of a skill. Research related to attention allocation could also be, or was also a common topic, and that has close relations to memory, particularly the capacity of a person's working memory, and then how we store motor skill patterns into long-term memory for later recall or retrieval. Some of those topics might sound familiar to you if you've taken 312 already. If you're concurrently taking Kin 312 or you're going to take it soon, you get to actually study a lot more of these in depth. Some of the key people that are associated with the information processing perspective are more known in relation to general psychology. So Albert Bandura and his social learning theory were kind of based on classical and operant conditioning. Some of you might be more familiar with conditioning through Pavlov's dogs, or the study of Pavlov's dogs, in which a particular response, which was drooling, was conditioned with the sound of a bell, which was the stimulus, used in association with a reward or punishment. In that Pavlov's dog's case, it was reward with food. B.F. Skinner and his theory of behaviorism was also kind of a fundamental theory that led into this information processing perspective, and that looked at consequences of behavior, again, reinforcements or punishments, and then how that influenced continuing behaviors. So also very similar to the social learning theory. In summary, we don't really focus that much on the information processing perspective in this class. It still considers the brain as a primary contributor to developmental processes, but the emphasis is on environmental influences and how those actually drive the motor development you end up observing. So now, moving from maturationist perspective or maturational perspective to the information processing perspective is taking more of the emphasis away from the individual and more towards the environment. That brings us to the ecological perspective, which, as mentioned previously, is the more prevalent of the motor development perspectives in present day. It's the one that our book has adopted and is kind of the one we're going to keep referring to, or at least components we'll keep referring to throughout this semester. So this perspective appeared in the 1980s, again, accepted to present day, and it predominantly explained the developmental changes as a result of interrelationships between the individual, the task, and the environment. So I just used Space Jam because it seemed relevant. I don't know. But this should sound familiar because this is Newell's constraint model that we talked about last week. So this is an appealing theory because we can acknowledge both biological and psychological aspects of the individual and then how those factors influence development just as much as external factors or constraints from the environment or the task being performed. The ecological perspective is different from the maturational perspective in the respect that it doesn't constrain development just to the central nervous system. Rather, the development of all body systems are considered in the motor development process. Additionally, the ecological perspective ranges across the entire lifespan. So it views development as a continuous, age-related process of change in movement and interacting constraints, which is the definition I gave you guys for motor development last week. So this is in contrast to the maturational perspective, which was primarily concerned with development through early adulthood to the end of puberty. Classical maturational perspective is primarily focused on infancy, whereas the more descriptive theories or descriptive periods were concerned with the later childhood to adolescence. The ecological perspective is also different from the information processing perspective in the respect that perception of the environment can be processed and controlled without executive function from the brain. So it's believed that a central processor, like if we were solely reliant on the brain to do everything for us, that the brain would eventually become overwhelmed with the amount of stimuli that are coming in from the environment. So you guys understand, like, we have reflexes that are still that still control some of our movements, right? Like a withdrawal reflex if we touch something hot. Like, even though we have other stuff going on in our environment, we have certain receptors throughout our body that can still control movement without the need for a central processor to do everything. Because if we relied on that, those neural circuits take a lot longer. And by the time we're like, oh yeah, my hand hurts, it would be kind of late, and then we're injured. So, ecological perspective kind of takes some of the pressure and the workload off of this idea that we have a central processor that has to do everything. There are two branches of the ecological perspective. There's the dynamical systems approach, which is more concerned with motor control and coordination. Primary people involved are Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey. And then the second branch is noted as the perception action approach, with primary influences from J.J. Gibson. And that approach is centralized around the development of sensations, how we perceive those sensations, and then how our perceptions drive our action. We'll discuss both of these a little bit more in detail, starting with the dynamical systems approach. So Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey are there's three of them, I can't count. They are thought to be some of the primary contributors to the development of this theory in the early 1980s, with influence from Nikolai Bernstein, who had more prominent work in like World War times through the 50s and 60s. I actually just got to take a class related to the dynamical systems approach, and we looked at like Bernstein's original works and lots of papers from Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey, and Latosh. These names probably don't mean a whole lot to a bunch of you, but it's kind of cool now that I get to like apply the things that I'm learning in my program to stuff that I get to teach you guys. But these individuals suggested that the organization of both physical and chemical systems help to shape behavior. That is, the chemical connection between our brain and our body, as well as physical aspects of the world, help to kind of dictate how we interact and move with our environment. The structural organization of the body and characteristics of the environment act to constrain the functional organization of the body into different movement patterns. So if you guys have taken Kin 312, these movement patterns are often considered to exist on a spectrum of stability, or what we refer to as attractor states. And if there are influence from the environment, which are also referred to as parameters, that cause some shift towards being unstable, a new movement pattern or compensatory movement results from further self-organization of structural parts. So this theory is different from the maturational perspective in the sense that coordinated behavior is not hardwired or rooted in biological processes. Rather, the coordinated movements or behaviors just happen as a result of the body wanting to be stable and biomechanically efficient. This ultimately allows for greater flexibility and adaptability to different constraints or obstacles or conditions in the environment. So if we are reaching and grasping for something, we can change our behavior based on the constraints of the environment, right? What's the size or the shape of the object we're grasping for? Or is there something in the environment that's going to affect the speed at which we're reaching and grasping? Okay, so because we have kind of an infinite number of possibilities of things that could happen in our environment, we then have an infinite number of possible coordinated patterns that can be a result. So it's not hardwired. Spontaneous self-organization of body systems is how we help to explain the sequential aspect of development, because we know it's a continuous and age-related process. So because body systems develop at different rates, that concept kind of feeds into the existence of what we call rate limiters or controllers, which will influence the rate of progression of certain motor behaviors. So the idea here is that as your body systems mature, more skills or abilities are likely to appear because the development of a system permits previously restricted movements to emerge. I included a figure that the book has just so you have like a visual representation of how this might work. So let's say we have a developmental trajectory, which we said usually tracks some type of motor behavior or physical characteristic over a period of time. Okay, so within our dynamical systems approach, there is a certain threshold that needs to be met in order for a certain behavior to appear. So let's say in this example that our developmental trajectory has some threshold needed for the behavior to emerge. Now, we have different body systems. For this example, we have 4. And this threshold is reached at some time point in each of these systems. So let's say system 1 could be the sensory abilities and perceptions of the nervous system. So these are fundamental senses such as smell, taste, touch, vision, hearing, and any reflexes that automatically are innate to our bodies when we're born. Okay, these would be fundamental for observation of our surroundings and how we might interact with our surroundings. So let's say that the behavior we're interested in looking at is walking. Okay, we would need to be able to take in information from our environment and sense information, perceive information from our environment. We might need some reflexes in order to build movement or activation patterns within our muscles, such as like the stepping reflex, which we'll talk about next week. So that's kind of a fundamental system that has to be at some level of maturity to meet this threshold. System 2 might be more related to our nervous system in the sense that we've got more cognitive or psychological abilities to build associations. So this could stem from an infant's ability to associate a stimulus with a response or an object with a specific task. If we're still using the example of walking and that's the behavior we're trying to achieve, locomoting requires that you move your body from one location to another one. So once we understand the concept that when we move our limbs in a certain way, we start to move, that would be required in order to locomote or walk. And then after that point, we've made the association, then it's actually figuring out strategies to complete the skill. System 3 might be based on physical growth or our skeletal system. So you could think of this in terms of like our distribution of weight around our center of mass, which would allow for more coordinated movement, right? So as we'll discuss in later chapters, babies have really big heads, which offsets their distribution of their center of mass to be higher or like further away from the ground. So a lot of times if you like even gently tap a baby, they will like head first fall over because their center of mass distribution isn't like our bodies. Okay, so as the skeletal system develops and limbs become longer, the placement of the center of mass is going to shift lower in the body, which would make it easier to control coordinated movement. So once we have the skeletal system reach a certain threshold, it's actually easier to perform our walking behavior. Our final system, or system 4, might be related to a muscular strength. Okay, so babies will build muscular strength as they, are able to support themselves on the floor. Once they're able to sit by themselves and have more trunk stability, they might then move to a standing position and then build the muscular strength in their legs so that they then can support their body weight as they start to take steps. Okay, so muscular strength would also allow for control of coordination and variability within movement related to walking behaviors. The development of the motor skill of interest is going to be dependent on the slowest of the necessary systems to reach a threshold. And what we call this slow system is a rate limiter. So in this case, system 4, muscular strength, would be considered the rate limiter for the behavior of walking, because you can't walk until your legs have developed enough strength to support the weight of your body. In comparison to the maturational perspective, rate limiters are not just limited to the central nervous system, but all of the body systems. And we're also not limited to working up to a threshold to see the appearance and development of motor skills, which is kind of where maturational perspective dropped off. Rather, we also can look at how body systems begin to decline or deteriorate to that given threshold again. And then in that scenario, rate limiters would be reintroduced that begin to limit or change how we might behave in a certain way. So the nice thing about the dynamical systems approach is it remains flexible to changes in all systems at different points in time, even if some rate limiters may apply to some individuals while not to others. I have 2 more slides. So I know this video is a slight bit longer than I thought it was going to be. But the last approach in our ecological perspective is the perception-action approach. which was proposed by J.J. Gibson in the 60s and 70s, but didn't actually start to gain traction until closer to the late 70s and 80s. Gibson believed that there was a strong interrelationship between perceptual and motor systems, and emphasized that these systems eventually evolve together. In his approach, the term affordances was introduced to describe the function an environmental object provides to an individual. So this is materialized as the assessment of physical characteristics of the object in comparison to the physical characteristics of the person, which we often refer to as body scaling, which is defined as like using intrinsic rather than extrinsic dimensions to complete movement. An affordance example might be like a horizontal surface or the ground that affords humans like a place to sit or to walk versus a vertical surface which might afford a person a place to lean or prop something against. Okay. The relationship between the individual and the environment in this approach are so critically linked that oftentimes a person's physical characteristics will end up defining an object's meaning or its affordances. So, in other words, a person's perception of the environment is very egocentric or related to their own physical properties, and that ultimately influences how they will interact with their environment. So, how we perceive influences how we act. Affordances and body scaling are also related to the relationship between the individual and task constraints. So, an example of this would be if we're climbing stairs. So a person has to consider their individual constraints, such as their limb length, their strength, their range of motion, with various task constraints like step height, perhaps. Okay, so the way that like a grown full-size adult would walk up steps might be very different from how a toddler or a baby walks up steps, because that step height is going to be perceived as a lot higher for a very shorter baby toddler person than it would for people like you or I. We could also use the concepts of body scaling and affordances to make activities easier or more difficult by changing like the size of equipment we give somebody, or we change the affordances that are adopted by that particular object. So some examples might be like we provide children with larger crayons or pencils to draw or write with to account for the fact that they're still developing fine motor skills. For an elderly person who starts to have deterioration in their like their muscle composition, or they have a neurodegenerative disease, and that leads to loss of stability, they might use a cane or a walker to locomote, which affords them more stability by increasing their base of support. That last example that I gave is a good way of highlighting that affordances change as an individual changes. So again, affordances are largely based on this concept of body scaling, where the function of that object is based on our perception. The last primary feature of the perception action theory is that perception of the environment occurs directly and constantly. So this varies from the information processing theory, which argues that the brain can perform like a limitless number of calculations using stimulus information to determine, like, let's say, the speed and direction of both the person and the objects within their environment. And that's whether objects in the environment are moving and or stationary. So if I'm walking up to a set of stairs, those stairs are going to be expanding as I get closer. Information processing theory would say, like, I am X far away from stairs, therefore my speed of approach before I have to start slowing down before I take a step, that's where that perspective goes. Perception action theory is going to argue that our perception is direct and constant. So in other words, that means we are constantly sensing and perceiving stimuli, to end up creating this optic flow that provides us with both time and space information. So using the rate of expansion, or using like binocular vision to kind of gauge that one object that is smaller is further away than an object that appears to be larger. And then when we have changes in those perceptions over time, that ultimately ends up providing us with the information on how we act or react to our changing environment. In summary, there are three predominant perspectives of motor development. So we have our maturational perspective, which has an emphasis on biological factors being the driving force of development, specific emphasis on the central nervous system. The descriptive periods that emerge from the maturational perspective emphasize the attainment of new motor skills and then the evolution of those motor skills based on age-related norms or standards. The information processing perspective placed a greater emphasis on the environment as a driving force of development by providing stimuli to the individual who then processes and creates an output to generate movements. The ecological perspective highlighted the importance of the interaction of all of our body systems and other individual constraints, as well as the interaction of those individual constraints with other constraints from the task and the environment. I do want to point out that each perspective focuses on different aspects of development. That means that some perspectives are going to be reserved for specific aspects of development or age groups. So example might be like the maturational perspective, or the classical maturationist perspective is going to focus more on infancy versus the descriptive periods, which focus more on the late childhood and adolescence. I think I mentioned that earlier. Another example of this could be like the information processing might be more interested in age differences in processing abilities in contrast to ecological theories, which are more concerned with how we transition from one skill to another. Okay, so that wraps up our theoretical perspectives in motor development. Our next video will be based on Chapter 3, which discusses the principles of motion and stability.